If you grew up in the Western world, your understanding of human history was likely shaped by a single dominant narrative, that civilization was born exclusively in the Old World. We are taught to look toward the sun-drenched floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates in ancient Mesopotamia, the golden sands along the Nile in Egypt, the Indus Valley in South Asia, and the fertile banks of the Yellow River in China. These places are etched into our collective consciousness as the legendary cradles of civilization, the unique, independent hearths where humanity first stepped out of the wilderness, laid down the plow, built walled cities, created written languages, and established empires. For centuries, mainstream historians operated under a quiet assumption that the Americas were merely a late addition to this story. The traditional narrative insisted that human beings migrated across the icy Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, remaining simple hunter-gatherer tribes for thousands of years, only managing to forge complex societies long after Europe and Asia were already building colossal monuments. Even when modern eyes turned to the magnificent stone temples of the Maya or the sprawling imperial capital of the Aztecs, those accomplishments were framed as relatively recent developments, flashes of brilliance that occurred shortly before European contact shattered their worlds forever. But that entire story, as polished and familiar as it sounds, is fundamentally incomplete. Deep within the suffocating, mosquito-choked river basins of southern Mexico, swallowed by mud and dense tropical foliage, lies the physical evidence of a forgotten American genesis. Long before the first Aztec stone was laid in Tenochtitlan, long before the Maya carved their intricate astronomical calendars into limestone, and long before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, an extraordinary culture emerged in total isolation from the rest of the planet. They were the Olmec. They built giant urban centers out of raw earth and solid stone without ever coming into contact with the Old World. They developed complex religions, engineered massive artificial plateaus, invented the concept of zero, birthed the oldest written glyphs in the Western Hemisphere, and carved multi-ton monuments out of volcanic basalt with nothing more than stone tools, sand, and water. Yet for thousands of years, the world did not even know their name. They were literally erased from human memory. Today, we stand on the precipice of a historical revolution because understanding the Olmec isn't just about admiring ancient ruins, it is about realizing that America had its own independent birth of civilization, a true mother culture that laid the blueprint for an entire continent. To understand how this forgotten chapter of history came back to light, we have to travel back to late August in the year 1862. The world at large was distracted by incredible turmoil. In the United States, the bloody reality of the American Civil War was unfolding on battlefields like Shiloh and Antietam. In Mexico, political chaos reigned as French imperial forces fought to establish an empire under Ferdinand Maximilian. But far away from the battlefields, in the quiet, humid backcountry of the state of Veracruz, near a small village called Tres Zapotes, a local peasant farm worker named Jose Melgar was simply trying to clear land for a sugarcane field.
As Melgar hacked through the overgrown jungle vines with his machete, his metal blade slammed against a hard, smooth object hidden beneath the rich, dark soil. At first, he thought nothing of it. Rocks were common in the terrain, but as he cleared away the surrounding mud, he realized the surface was unusually smooth, rounded, and dark. Rumors had circulated in the surrounding villages for generations about Spanish gold buried by centuries-old pirates or conquistadors. Thinking he had stumbled upon a buried iron cauldron full of treasure turned upside down, Melgar returned the next day with shovels, determined to dig it up and claim his fortune. As Melgar dug deeper, 1 foot, 3 feet, 5 feet into the earth, the treasure he uncovered was far stranger and far more valuable than gold. Emerging from the mud was a magnificent multi-ton human head carved out of a single continuous block of dark volcanic basalt. The face staring back at him was unlike anything he or anyone in modern history had ever seen. It possessed broad, prominent cheekbones, thick, fleshy lips, a broad nose, and deep-set eyes that seemed to look through the observer with quiet authority. On its head was a tight-fitting helmet or headpiece strapped across the brow. Melgar was mesmerized. He eventually wrote a brief report for the Mexican Society of Geography and Statistics, describing the artifact as a work of art that demonstrated remarkable sculptural skill. However, because the facial features appeared distinct from the typical artistic styles of local indigenous groups known at the time, Melgar made an assumption that was common in the 19th century. He theorized that the sculpture must have been carved by ancient African travelers who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean thousands of years earlier. While modern genetics, archaeology, and dental analysis have thoroughly disproved the African origin hypothesis, confirming that the Olmec were unequivocally indigenous Native Americans, Melgar's radical theory highlighted a very real problem that academic circles were totally unprepared to face. Who on earth carved a massive 10-ton stone head in the middle of a swamp, and why didn't it match anything in the existing historical record? For over 70 decades following José Melgar's discovery, the head at Tres Zapotes was treated as a bizarre, inconvenient anomaly. Mainstream archaeologists throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries were firmly committed to a rigid dogma. That dogma dictated that the Maya civilization was the undisputed cradle of Mesoamerican culture. Figures like Sir Eric Thompson and Sylvanus Morley, the undisputed giants of Maya archaeology at the time, dominated the field. They viewed the Maya as a uniquely peaceful, hyper-intelligent elite of astronomer priests who had independently invented science, writing, and architecture in the jungles of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. Any artifact found outside the Maya region that seemed old was routinely dismissed as a crude imitation or a late trade item. The idea that another, older culture existed before the Maya, a culture that might have actually taught the Maya everything they knew, was viewed as complete scientific heresy. The establishment simply refused to believe that an advanced society could have flourished in the inhospitable swamps of Veracruz. Enter Matthew Stirling. In the late 1930s, Stirling, an adventurous and fiercely independent archaeologist working for the Smithsonian Institution, became obsessed with José Melgar's forgotten report. Driven by an overwhelming curiosity, Stirling convinced the National Geographic Society and the Smithsonian to fund an expedition into the deep interior of southern Mexico in 1938. The journey was nothing short of an ordeal.
Stirling and his team, accompanied by his brilliant wife and collaborator Marion Stirling, traveled by steamship, riverboat, horseback, and foot, wading through thigh-deep mud, braving swarms of disease-carrying mosquitoes, and navigating treacherous river currents. When they finally arrived at Tres Zapotes, Stirling didn't just re-examine Melgar's giant head. He began systematic, aggressive excavations across the surrounding terrain. On January 16, 1939, Stirling hit the archaeological jackpot. His team uncovered a broken stone monument known today as Stela C. On one side of the stone was an intricate, stylized carving of a jaguar deity. But when Stirling flipped the stone over, he saw a clean vertical column of carved bars and dots, the distinctive numerical system used in Mesoamerican long-count calendars. Stirling sat down in his tent, carefully translated the bar and dot symbols, and calculated the date carved into the stone. The date on Stela C converted in the modern calendar to September 3, 31 BC. To understand the earthquake this date caused in the scientific community, you have to realize that 31 BC was centuries before the classic Maya built their very first cities. Stirling had found concrete physical proof that writing, calendar mathematics, and monumental stone carving were fully developed long before the Maya Empire ever bloomed. When Stirling published his findings in 1940, claiming that an unknown pre-Maya civilization was the true progenitor of Mesoamerican culture, the academic world exploded into open warfare. Eric Thompson and the Mayanist elite publicly accused Stirling of misinterpreting the dates, claiming he had misread the stone or that the monument had been moved from somewhere else. For over 10 years, Stirling was painted as a rogue scholar, pushing a radical fantasy. But Stirling didn't back down. He returned to the region year after year, unearthing even larger, more mind-blowing sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo. Then, in the 1950s, a revolutionary technology arrived that changed archaeology forever: carbon dating, developed by chemist Willard Libby. For the first time, scientists didn't have to rely on artistic style or historical guesswork to date an object. They could test organic wood charcoal from ancient fire pits and measure the radioactive decay of carbon-14. Stirling sent samples of charcoal excavated from deep within the architectural foundations of Olmec sites to the laboratories. When the test results came back, they didn't just confirm Stirling's 31 BC date, they obliterated even his most radical estimates. The carbon dating proved that Olmec urban centers were not from 31 BC, but were thriving as early as 1500 BC. That is over 3,500 years ago. The debate was over. Stirling had been right all along. The Maya were not the beginning of the story. They were the heirs to an ancient, magnificent legacy that went back 3.5 millennia into the mist of time. Once the existence of the Olmecs was indisputably proven, historians were forced to confront a massive ecological riddle. Why here? If you were a group of ancient people trying to build a nation from scratch, the Gulf Coast lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco would likely be the very last place on Earth you would pick. The environment is brutal. It receives up to 120 inches of rainfall every single year. The landscape is a labyrinth of low-lying swamps, stagnant oxbow lakes, mudflats, and dense, impenetrable rainforests infested with deadly snakes, jaguars, and swarms of biting insects. The heat is oppressive, and humidity hovers near 100% year-round. Stone suitable for building or carving doesn't even exist in the immediate lowland soil. It had to be fetched from mountain ranges miles away. So why did the first advanced civilization in the Americas take root in what appears to be a tropical hellscape?
The answer lies in understanding the hidden, incredible wealth of river ecosystems. The Olmec heartland was dominated by major river networks, most notably the mighty Coatzacoalco River system. Every year during the rainy season, these rivers would burst their banks, overflowing onto the flat floodplains. Just like the annual flooding of the Nile in Egypt or the Tigris in Mesopotamia, these river floods deposited millions of tons of rich, black, nutrient-dense silt onto the surrounding lands. When the floodwaters naturally receded, they left behind some of the most fertile agricultural soil on the surface of the planet. While surrounding mountain tribes had to scrape a living out of rocky, poor soil, the Olmec were able to plant crops in soft river silt that required minimal tilling and produced astonishingly massive yields. And the cornerstone of this agricultural revolution was a plant that changed human history forever: maize, or ancient corn. Through centuries of selective breeding, early indigenous Americans transformed a wild, scrawny grass called teosinte into a thick, nutrient-rich staple crop. In the fertile river basins of the Olmec heartland, maize didn't just grow, it exploded. The Olmec were able to harvest 2, sometimes 3 crop cycles a year. They combined corn with beans and squash, a dietary combination that provided all the essential amino acids necessary for a complete human diet. Combined with the abundance of aquatic life in the rivers, fish, turtles, clams, and wild game in the forests, the Olmec faced no food shortages. This massive food surplus changed everything. When a society can produce far more food than it needs to survive, a fundamental transformation occurs. Not every person needs to work in the fields.
For the first time in American history, a society could support a massive class of non-farming specialists: engineers to design cities, stonemasons to carve art, priests to study the stars, traders to forge regional networks, and political leaders to organize thousands of laborers. The swamp wasn't a barrier to civilization, it was the supercharged engine that powered it. Around 1200 BC, this agricultural wealth culminated in the rise of the world's first true Mesoamerican metropolis, San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan. Rising dramatically out of the swampy river basins of Veracruz, San Lorenzo was not a random cluster of mud huts. It was a masterpiece of ancient urban planning and landscape engineering. The Olmec did not simply find a hill and build on top of it. They took a natural ridge and literally re-engineered the earth. Over generations, Olmec laborers moved millions of cubic feet of soil, basketful by basketful, building an artificial plateau that rose more than 100 feet above the surrounding floodplains and stretched for nearly a mile in length. Think about the sheer human coordination required to accomplish that feat. Without draft animals like oxen or horses, without metal shovels, and without wheeled carts, human beings carried millions of tons of clay and gravel on their backs to create an elevated, flood-proof island sanctuary for their elite rulers and sacred temples. On top of this elevated plateau, the Olmec constructed magnificent royal compounds, public plazas, and ceremonial mounds. But one of their most impressive engineering triumphs lay hidden beneath the surface of the earth. Excavators at San Lorenzo discovered an intricate, highly sophisticated subterranean drainage system. The Olmec carved hundreds of heavy basalt stones into precise U-shapes, fitted them together end to end, and covered them with flat stone caps, burying them deep beneath the clay plazas. It was the very first plumbing system in the Americas, engineered over 3,000 years ago to control the element that surrounded them: water.
San Lorenzo was the absolute center of power, wealth, and innovation in the New World. It was a city where sacred kings ruled as intermediaries between the human realm and the mysterious spirit world. But as impressive as their architecture and engineering were, the true signature of San Lorenzo's power was carved in stone, monuments that would mystify humanity for millennia to come. How did the Olmec manage to transport massive boulders weighing up to 40 tons from distant volcanic mountains across 30 miles of flooded terrain to reach San Lorenzo without the wheel? Who were the individuals immortalized in these stone giants? Were they kings, gods, or sacrificed warriors? And what caused this incredible glittering metropolis of San Lorenzo to suddenly collapse into violence and ruin around 900 BC, giving rise to an even stranger sanctuary at Venta? We have only just scratched the surface of America's first civilization.
To stand before a giant Olmec colossal head is to experience an uncomfortable sense of humility. These are not mere statures, they are massive, thunderous statements of raw power, carved into solid volcanic rock. To date, 17 of these colossal heads have been discovered across the Olmec heartland: 10 at San Lorenzo, 4 at Venta, 2 at Tres Zapotes, and 1 at La Cobata. The smallest weighs around 6 tons, while the largest, found at La Cobata, towers over 10 feet tall and weighs an astounding 40 tons. That is heavier than a fully loaded commercial semi-truck. When you consider the sheer scale of these monuments, you are forced to ask the fundamental question that has haunted engineers and archaeologists for generations. How did a Stone Age society accomplish this? The basalt used to carve these colossal faces did not exist anywhere near the swampy river plains of San Lorenzo or Venta. The nearest source of high-density volcanic rock was the Sierra de los Tuxtlas mountain range, located over 30 to 60 miles away, across some of the most difficult flooded terrain on the continent. The Olmec had no draft animals like horses, oxen, or camels to pull heavy loads. They had no iron or bronze tools to split the mountain stone, and they had not implemented the wheel for heavy transportation. Yet somehow they quarried giant basalt boulders from the slopes of the Tuxtla Mountains and transported them across dozens of miles of thick rainforest, muddy swamps, and open rivers. Modern experimental archaeologists believe that the Olmec used a combination of incredible physical labor, ingenious wooden sledge systems, and water logistics. During the dry season, hundreds of laborers likely used stone hammers and fire-cracking techniques to detach massive basalt blocks from the mountainside. They then loaded these giant basalt boulders onto wooden sledges and dragged them across prepared earthen tracks, using wooden rollers lubricated with mud. When the seasonal monsoon rains arrived and the rivers rose, the Olmec loaded these giant stones onto massive wooden rafts or twin canoe catamarans, floating them down the swollen Coatzacoalcos river system directly to their island cities. To pull off a logistical operation of this scale required not just brute force, but an absolute mastery of hydrological engineering, physics, and human organization. Once the massive blocks arrived at urban centers like San Lorenzo, master sculptors went to work. Equipped only with stone hammerstones made of tough quartzite, obsidian blades, abrasive quartz sand, and water, these artisans spent months, perhaps years, pounding away at the rock. They did not just scrape the surface, they sculpted deep, expressive facial features with astonishing three-dimensional depth. What makes these 17 heads so profoundly mesmerizing is that no two are alike. Every single head has a distinct individual human face. One features a stern, authoritative glare with down-turned lips. Another wears a faint, enigmatic smirk. A third has deep creases around the eyes, suggesting advanced age or wisdom. Furthermore, each head wears a unique, customized helmet or headpiece adorned with symbolic motifs, ranging from jaguar paws and bird feathers to geometric crests and animal hides. Because of these highly individualized features, the vast majority of modern scholars agree that these colossal heads are not generic depictions of gods. They are realistic portraits of actual living Olmec rulers, sacred kings who governed these ancient city-states. In Olmec spiritual ideology, the human head was believed to be the ultimate vessel of the soul, the seat of a person's life force, intellect, and spiritual power, known in later Mesoamerican traditions as the tonali. By carving the likeness of a king into imperishable volcanic stone on a superhuman scale, the Olmec were asserting that the king's power was immortal, echoing through the cosmos long after his physical body had returned to the earth. Yet, when archaeologists excavated these giant heads at San Lorenzo, they discovered something deeply disturbing. Many of the heads were not found standing proudly in public plazas. Instead, they were found buried deep underground, lined up in neat rows, were dumped at the bottom of steep ravines. Even stranger, many of the sculptures showed severe signs of intentional physical destruction. Deep gouges had been smashed into their cheeks, large pits were pounded into their foreheads, and stone ears and noses had been deliberately chipped away. For decades, historians assumed this damage was proof of a violent foreign invasion, that a rival culture had marched into San Lorenzo, overthrown the Olmec, and desecrated the statues of their fallen kings in a rage of conquest. Yet as excavations deepened, a much more complex and fascinating reality emerged. The damage on the statues wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, controlled, and precise. Many of the pits and gouges were repolished after they were smashed. This led archaeologists to realize that the defacement of these monuments was not an act of enemy vandalism, but a sacred internal ritual performed by the Olmec themselves. When an Olmec king died, his spiritual power remained entrapped inside his stone portrait. To safely neutralize that power and allow the new king to assume divine authority, the community would conduct a ritual execution of the monument. They would rhythmically strike the stone head to release the deceased king's spirit, ritually neutralizing the monument before burying it with full ceremonial honors. In some remarkable cases, sculptors didn't just smash the dead king's statue, they completely recarved his giant stone throne into a brand new colossal head for his successor, recycling political power in stone. While the Olmec demonstrated their political authority through colossal basalt sculptures, their spiritual devotion was expressed in an entirely different medium: green jadeite and serpentine. To the Olmec, green stone was infinitely more valuable than gold. Gold was soft and yellow, associated merely with the sun, but translucent green jade was the physical embodiment of life itself. It represented fresh water, the green shoots of growing corn, fertility, and immortal soul force. Jadeite is one of the hardest minerals on Earth, significantly tougher than iron, and extremely difficult to carve without modern diamond-tipped tools. Yet Olmec artisans carved jade with a level of delicacy and fluidity that rivals the finest Renaissance sculptors. They created smooth, lustrous jade celts, ceremonial axes, and small statuettes that feel almost soft to the touch. Because high-grade jadeite did not exist in the Olmec heartland, they launched long-distance procurement expeditions over hundreds of miles into the rugged mountains of the Motagua River Valley in modern-day Guatemala. This proves that as early as 1000 BC, the Olmec had already established a sophisticated, long-distance trade network that spanned across Central America. When you examine Olmec jade carvings, one bizarre and haunting motif appears over and over again: the were-jaguar. This supernatural entity is depicted as a strange, supernatural hybrid, part human infant, part snarling jaguar. These figurines feature cleft heads with deep V-shaped splits at the top of the skull, flame-like eyebrows, toothless or fanged mouths turned down in a grimace, and almond-shaped eyes staring blankly ahead.
For centuries, Western scholars struggled to comprehend what these strange jaguar babies represented. Today, we understand that the were-jaguar was the central pillar of Olmec shamanic religion. To the Olmec, the jaguar was the ultimate apex predator of the rainforest, a terrifying beast that could swim in water, walk on land, climb trees, and see in total darkness. The jaguar was the master of all realms. Olmec shamans and kings believed that through intense spiritual rituals, trance states, and bloodletting ceremonies, they could spiritually transform themselves into jaguars, bridging the boundary between the physical world and the spirit underworld to bring rain, maize, and prosperity to their people. This deep spiritual connection to transformation and cosmic balance was not just confined to stone carvings and shamanic rituals. It was physically enacted through a deadly, high-stakes ceremony that would define Mesoamerican culture for the next 3,000 years: the sacred Ballgame. Long before basketball or soccer were conceived in the modern world, the Olmec invented the world's first organized team sport played with a solid rubber ball. But to call it a sport is to fundamentally misunderstand its weight. To the Olmec, the ball game was a cosmic drama, a physical reenactment of the eternal battle between light and darkness, the movement of the sun across the sky, and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. To play this game, the Olmec pulled off another incredible technological feat that predated Western science by millennia: the invention of vulcanized rubber. Raw rubber latex, tapped from the native Castilla elastica rubber trees of the rainforest, is naturally brittle, sticky, and rots quickly in tropical heat.
Around 1600 BC, Olmec chemists discovered that if they mixed raw tree latex with the juice squeezed from the morning glory vine, a miraculous chemical reaction occurred. The sulfur compounds in the morning glory juice vulcanized the latex, transforming it into a durable, highly elastic, solid rubber material. They used this rubber to manufacture heavy, solid balls weighing anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds. Players competed in narrow stone courts, using only their hips, thighs, and elbows to keep the dense, lethal ball in constant motion without letting it touch the ground. The game was brutally physical, often resulting in severe internal injuries or death for the players. In its most ceremonial iterations, the ballgame concluded with human sacrifice, where the blood of defeated players or captured prisoners was offered to the earth to ensure that the sun would continue to rise and the rains would fall upon the crops. For over 3 centuries, from 1200 BC to 900 BC, San Lorenzo stood as the unchallenged beating heart of this thriving world. Its palaces overflowed with trade goods, its plazas echoed with sacred chants, and its colossal stone heads dominated the landscape. But around 900 BC, disaster struck. In a remarkably short span of time, San Lorenzo experienced a sudden, catastrophic collapse. The great city was abandoned, its public monuments were systematically smashed or buried, and its grand artificial plateau fell silent. Historians still debate the exact cause of San Lorenzo's sudden demise. Was it a bloody social revolution, where the oppressed working class rose up against the divine kings who demanded endless physical labor? Or was it an environmental catastrophe caused by tectonic shifts that altered the flow of the Coatzacoalco River, drying up their vital trade canals and suffocating their agricultural floodplains? Whatever the cause, the fall of San Lorenzo did not mean the end of Olmec civilization. As the torches went out in San Lorenzo, the flame of Olmec power shifted 60 miles to the east to a new, even grander island sanctuary, surrounded by deep coastal swamps, La Venta.
Rising in the modern Mexican state of Tabasco, La Venta ushered in the second most opulent era of Olmec history. The rulers of La Venta took architectural ambition to unprecedented heights. At the heart of their new city, they constructed North America's very first monumental pyramid, the Great Pyramid of La Venta. Rising over 100 feet into the air, this massive earthen cone was built entirely by hand, using over 100,000 cubic meters of clay and earth. Designed to mimic the shape of a sacred volcano, the Great Pyramid dominated the skyline, serving as a massive artificial mountain connecting the earth to the heavens. At La Venta, the Olmec took their obsession with sacred geometry and underground offerings to an almost supernatural level. Beneath the surface of the city's ceremonial plazas, archaeologists discovered vast, hidden treasures that were never meant to be seen by human eyes. In several locations, Olmec laborers dug deep, massive pits into the earth, lined them with colored clays, and arranged thousands of polished green serpentine tiles depicting the face of the jaguar god. Once these magnificent green stone mosaics were completed, the Olmec performed an act that baffles modern minds. They immediately buried them under tons of yellow, pink, and red clays, sealing them forever beneath the earth. These were not public art installations. They were massive, hidden spiritual bribes offered directly to the deities of the underworld, a physical sacrifice of wealth to maintain cosmic harmony. Under the shadow of La Venta's Great Pyramid, Olmec civilization reached the absolute zenith of its artistic, architectural, and intellectual wealth. But as La Venta expanded its reach, it set into motion a historic transformation that would ripple across the entire continent.
The Olmec were no longer just a local kingdom in a coastal swamp. They were morphing into an expansive, far-reaching cultural superpower whose ideas, gods, and technology were about to conquer the Western Hemisphere. As Venta reached the pinnacle of its wealth and architectural glory around 800 BC, a dramatic transformation began to sweep across the entire geography of ancient Mexico and Central America. The Olmec were no longer just an isolated river kingdom tucked away in the muddy floodplains of the Gulf Coast. They had evolved into a cultural and economic juggernaut whose ideas, symbols, religion, and technology were radiating outward into every corner of Mesoamerica. From the high mountain valleys of Oaxaca and the central highlands near modern-day Mexico City, down to the Pacific coast of Guatemala and the dense Maya lowlands, the distinct artistic signature of the Olmec began appearing everywhere. This far-reaching expansion has fueled one of the most fierce, defining debates in the history of archaeology. Was the Olmec civilization truly the undisputed mother culture of the Americas, or were they merely a sister culture working alongside other regional societies? For mid-20th century scholars like Alfonso Caso and Ignacio Bernal, the evidence was overwhelming. They argued that the Olmec were the supreme originators, the foundational engine that invented the core elements of Mesoamerican civilization and exported them to surrounding tribal groups who were far less advanced. While modern archaeologists often favor a more nuanced sister culture model, acknowledging that regional centers in Oaxaca and Chiapas were also developing their own unique traditions, no one can deny a simple, stunning reality. Wherever you look in ancient Mesoamerica, the blueprint of the Olmec is etched into the very soil. They created an intellectual and spiritual lingua franca that every major subsequent empire, from Tenochtitlan to Tikal, would speak for the next 2,000 years. To understand the sheer reach of Olmec soft power, one needs only to look at the remarkable trade networks they constructed across mountains, deserts, and jungles. The Olmec elite had an insatiable appetite for exotic, sacred materials that did not exist in their swampy lowland homeland. To acquire precious green jadeite, they sent merchant caravans deep into the Motagua River Valley of Guatemala. To obtain high-grade black obsidian, a razor-sharp volcanic glass crucial for surgical tools, weaponry, and ritual bloodletting blades, they forged trade alliances with communities in the highlands of Puebla, Pachuca, and Guatemala. In exchange for these raw materials, the Olmec exported finished luxury goods that carried immense prestige. They sent exquisite jade carvings, fine white ceramic pottery decorated with jaguar motifs, and rubber balls to distant regional leaders. Possessing an authentic Olmec artifact in a distant mountain village was the ultimate status symbol, signaling that a local chief was connected to the wealthy, divine rulers of the Gulf Coast. Nowhere is this cultural colonization more breathtaking than at the site of Chalcatzingo, located in the high valley of Morelos, hundreds of miles west of the Olmec heartland. There, carved directly onto the face of sheer granite cliffs overlooking the valley floor, are grand Olmec-style relief sculptures. One famous carving, known as the King, depicts an Olmec ruler dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes, sitting comfortably inside a stylized C-shaped cave mouth that represents the gaping maw of an earth monster. Out of the cave mouth, clouds of mist billow forth, bringing raindrops down upon fertile corn plants. The presence of such massive, permanent Olmec rock art hundreds of miles away from Veracruz proves that Olmec shamans and diplomats weren't just passing through, they were establishing permanent religious sanctuaries and controlling vital trade corridors far beyond their borders.
Even deeper into the mountainous wilderness of Guerrero, in dark subterranean caverns like Juxtlahuaca and Tenochtitlan, archaeologists discovered another stunning secret. Vibrant, full-color Olmec mural paintings painted onto the cave walls hundreds of feet below the surface of the earth.
These paintings depict Olmec rulers wearing grand bird-feathered headdresses, jaguar skin capes, and holding ceremonial tridents, standing triumphantly over kneeling subjects. To paint such elaborate scenes deep within sacred subterranean caves proves that the Olmec viewed caves as literal portals to the underworld, a core religious concept that would dominate Mesoamerican spirituality forever. While their trade networks and art spread across thousands of miles, the Olmec were quietly achieving an even greater, more revolutionary milestone in human history: the invention of writing and advanced mathematics in the Western Hemisphere. For generations, mainstream historians firmly believed that the Maya were the undisputed inventors of writing in the Americas. But in the late 1990s, road construction workers in a small Mexican village near San Lorenzo stumbled upon a heavy serpentine stone block buried in a gravel quarry. Known today as the Cascajal block, this slab of green stone turned out to be one of the most explosive archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Carved into the smooth surface of the Cascajal block are 62 distinct glyphic symbols, including depictions of ears of corn, fish, dart throwers, and geometric emblems. Geological testing and archaeological context dated the Cascajal block to around 900 BC. This meant that the Olmec were writing complex symbolic texts at least 500 years before the earliest known Maya inscriptions, making the Olmec script the oldest known writing system in the entire Western Hemisphere. Hand in hand with their writing system came a mind-boggling leap in mathematics and astronomy. The Olmec were among the very first human beings on Earth to independently discover and implement the concept of zero, an abstract mathematical milestone that neither the ancient Greeks nor the Romans ever managed to achieve. Using a remarkably simple and elegant bar and dot system, where a single dot represented the number 1, a horizontal bar represented the number 5, and a stylized shell symbol represented 0, the Olmec could calculate numbers into the millions and track the complex cycles of the celestial bodies across the sky. This mathematical system was the direct foundation for the famous Mesoamerican long count calendar. The long count was a non-repeating linear calendar system that tracked time continuously from a fixed, mythic starting point in the far distant past, calculated as August 11, 3114 BC. While the world later attributed this brilliant calendar system exclusively to the Maya, monuments like Stela C at Tres Zapotes prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Olmec were using this exact bar and dot calendar long before the Maya Empire even rose to power. As their scientists mapped the heavens and their scribes carved the first glyphs, Olmec priests were weaving together a vast, complex pantheon of gods that would become the spiritual foundation for every Mesoamerican culture that followed. At the absolute center of Olmec mythology was the maize god. The Olmec recognized that their entire civilization rested on the success of the corn crop, and so they personified corn as a young, vulnerable deity who underwent a continuous cycle of life, death, and resurrection. In Olmec art, the maize god is depicted with a cleft head out of which a green corn cob sprouts forth. This divine narrative was simple. The maize god must be buried in the dark earth like a seed, undergo a terrifying journey through the underworld, and be reborn in the spring to feed humanity. This exact mythic cycle of the dying and rising maize god became the emotional heart of the famous Maya sacred text, the Popol Vuh, thousands of years later.
Equally transformative was the Olmec creation of one of the most famous deities in world history, the feathered serpent. On Monument 19 at Venta, carved into a slab of hard basalt, is the world's earliest known depiction of a giant crested rattlesnake covered in plush bird feathers. The snake arches its body protectively around a human priest who holds a sacred shamanic incense bag. This hybrid beast, combining the grounded terrestrial power of the serpent with the celestial, skybound freedom of the bird, represented the ultimate synthesis of earth and heaven.
Centuries later, this exact Olmec deity would evolve into Quetzalcoatl for the Aztecs and Kukulkan for the Maya, the divine bringer of wind, learning, and civilization, worshipped at famous sites like Chichen Itza and Teotihuacan. The Olmec didn't just build a city, they constructed an entire cosmos of gods, demons, and sacred realms that gave meaning to human existence. To interact with these terrifying deities, Olmec rulers used a secret, highly sophisticated technology that bordered on divine magic: concave mirrors crafted from iron ore. High-status individuals at Venta were often buried wearing polished pendants made of hematite, magnetite, and ilmenite, rare iron minerals sourced from distant mountain ranges. Olmec stonemasons spent hundreds of hours grinding these dense metallic stones into parabolic concave mirrors, polishing them until their surfaces shone like liquid silver. These mirrors possessed incredible optical properties. When held in the sunlight, an Olmec priest could focus the sun's rays into a tight, searing beam of heat capable of instantly igniting a fire out of dried wood or cotton. To an ancient audience watching a priest start a fire out of thin air using light from the sun, the ruler appeared to possess the direct, terrifying power of the gods. Furthermore, when an observer looked into the concave mirror, their reflection appeared upside down and distorted, creating an eerie optical illusion that made it seem as though the observer was peering through a window directly into the spirit world. Every element of Olmec life was meticulously aligned with this spiritual cosmos, right down to the physical orientation of their cities. When engineers laid out the city of Venta, they didn't align its main axis with true north. Instead, they purposefully aligned the entire city 8 degrees west of north. For decades, scholars wondered why. Modern astronomical alignments revealed that this precise 8-degree offset aligned the city's central pyramid with the exact point on the horizon where the sun set during the summer solstice, while simultaneously pointing toward the peak of a sacred volcanic mountain miles away. The Olmec turned their entire city into an astronomical computer, a living, breathing sanctuary designed to mirror the harmony of the universe. By 500 BC, the Olmec had achieved everything a civilization could dream of. They had mastered art, engineering, trade, writing, mathematics, and religion. Their cultural footprint was stamped across an entire continent, and their great city of Venta stood as an unstoppable monument to human ingenuity. But history is a cruel master. Just as San Lorenzo had mysteriously crumbled centuries earlier, the dark shadows of collapse were slowly creeping toward the sacred towers of Venta.
By the year 400 BC, the grand city of Venta, the glittering jewel of the Olmec world, was dying. For nearly 5 centuries, its monumental earthen pyramid had dominated the tropical skyline. Its secret subterranean plazas had overflowed with buried green jade, and its divine kings had commanded the labor of tens of thousands of subjects. But suddenly, quietly, and irreversibly, the heartbeat of the city slowed to a stop. The colossal basalt heads were systematically buried, the royal palaces were deserted, and the jungle canopy began its slow, relentless march to reclaim the plazas. The collapse of Venta marks one of the most poignant turning points in ancient American history. Just as with San Lorenzo 500 years earlier, historians have spent decades piecing together the evidence to understand what triggered the ultimate downfall of Olmec civilization. Was it a bloody internal revolution, a catastrophic climate shift, or a sudden ecological breakdown? The primary culprit appears to be the very element that had allowed the Olmec to flourish in the first place: water. Geological studies of the river systems surrounding Venta revealed that around 400 BC, severe tectonic activity and volcanic eruptions in the nearby Tenochtitlan Mountains caused massive shifts in the regional topography.
Heavy volcanic ash choked the rivers, causing channels to silt up and alter their courses. The vital river systems that had delivered annual floodwaters full of black fertile silt suddenly dried up or turned into stagnant, disease-ridden marshes. Without the annual floodwaters, the Olmec agricultural engine ground to a halt. Massive crop failures led to widespread famine. In a society where rulers claimed divine power based on their ability to command the gods to bring rain and food, a prolonged ecological collapse was fatal to the political order. When the crops failed and the rivers died, the authority of the shaman kings shattered. The populace lost faith in their divine rulers, and the tightly organized social contract that had built the grandest monuments in the Americas simply unraveled. Yet the fall of Venta was not an abrupt, apocalyptic end to the Olmec people themselves. Cultures rarely vanish into thin air. Instead, they scatter, adapt, and evolve. As Venta fell into ruin, the surviving Olmec population dispersed into smaller, regional communities across the Gulf Coast and highlands. This final, fascinating twilight phase of their history, lasting from roughly 400 BC to 250 AD, is known to modern scholars as the Epi-Olmec period. During this Epi-Olmec era, the famous La Mojara Stela I was carved. Discovered by a local fisherman in the Aquila River in 1986, this massive 4-ton limestone slab contains over 400 intricate hieroglyphic characters alongside a detailed carving of an Epi-Olmec ruler named Harvest Mountain Lord.
The script, known as the Isthmian or Epi-Olmec script, is a fully developed phonetic writing system that serves as the ultimate linguistic bridge between the early symbols of the Olmec and the fully realized writing system of the classic Maya. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the intellectual flame lit by the Olmec never died. It was simply passed like a sacred torch to the next generation of American civilizations. As the Epi-Olmec tradition gradually faded into local regional cultures around 250 AD, a wave of historical amnesia washed over the world. The physical ruins of San Lorenzo and Venta were completely swallowed by dense tropical rainforest. For over a millennium and a half, the Olmec were forgotten by history. This tragic loss of memory allowed wild, sensationalized theories to fill the void during the 19th and 20th centuries. Pseudo-historians and fringe theorists claimed that because the Olmec created such staggering monuments in isolation, they must have been founded by mysterious visitors from ancient Egypt, lost travelers from Atlantis, or transoceanic sailors from Africa or Asia. However, 21st century science has dealt a decisive, fatal blow to these fringe myths. Advances in paleogenomics and ancient DNA extraction have allowed geneticists to extract and sequence human DNA from ancient burials across the Olmec heartland. The genetic results are absolute and undeniable. The Olmec possessed pure, unbroken Native American DNA, directly linked to modern indigenous populations living in Mexico today. Furthermore, linguistic analysis indicates that the Olmec spoke an ancient language belonging to the Mixozoican family, a family of indigenous languages still spoken by thousands of native people in Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Chiapas today. The Olmec were not foreign visitors. They were the brilliant indigenous sons and daughters of the American soil. Although the Olmec Empire physically vanished into the jungle mud, their cultural DNA became the foundational architecture for every single great civilization that rose in Mesoamerica for the next 2,000 years. When the classic Maya Empire began erecting their majestic limestone towers in the jungles of Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan, they did not invent their culture out of thin air. They built their empire directly on the shoulders of the Olmec. The Maya adopted the Olmec long count calendar, refined the bar and dot mathematical system, including the concept of zero, inherited the sacred Ballgame, and adopted the mythic narrative of the dying and rising maize god. Maya kings wore green jade jewelry, practiced shamanic bloodletting rituals, and styled their royal portraits after the divine courtly traditions established centuries earlier in the royal plazas of San Lorenzo.
Far to the north, in the high valley of Mexico, the legendary megacity of Teotihuacan, which grew to become one of the largest cities in the ancient world, with over 100,000 residents, drew its spiritual inspiration directly from the Olmec heritage. The central avenue of Teotihuacan was dominated by the grand temple of the feathered serpent, a direct architectural descendant of the feathered snake deity first carved on Monument 19 at La Venta. The engineers of Teotihuacan adopted the Olmec grid system, their obsession with green stone carvings, and their sophisticated water management technologies. Even 2,000 years after the fall of La Venta, when the aggressive Aztec Empire reached the height of its imperial power in the 15th century, the shadow of the Olmec still loomed large over the landscape. The Aztecs viewed the Gulf Coast lowlands as a mythic, enchanted paradise of wealth and mystery, calling it Tamawanchan, the sacred land of misty forests and rubber trees. In fact, when Aztec priests constructed the massive Templo Mayor pyramid at the heart of their capital city of Tenochtitlan, they conducted archaeological excavations of their own. They unearthed ancient Olmec jade masks and sculptures from buried ruins, carried them back to their capital, and ritually buried them beneath the floors of their grandest temples as sacred ancestral relics. The Aztecs knew that before their empire existed, a grand divine race of master builders had ruled the earth. Today, in the 21st century, we're witnessing a breathtaking new golden age of Olmec archaeology, thanks to cutting-edge technology. For over a century, archaeologists were limited by the impenetrable jungle canopy and deep swamps of southern Mexico. But the invention of LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has changed everything. By flying aircraft over the rainforest and firing millions of invisible laser beams per second through the dense tree canopy, scientists can create ultra-precise three-dimensional maps of the bare earth below. In recent years, LiDAR surveys across Veracruz and Tabasco have revealed hundreds of previously unknown massive ancient artificial platforms, ceremonial complexes, and buried earthen pyramids hiding in plain sight beneath modern cattle ranches and sugarcane fields. In 2020, LiDAR technology led to the discovery of Aguada Phoenix, a gigantic, previously unknown earthen platform near the Guatemalan border, measuring nearly a mile in length and rising from 30 to 50 feet high. Dated to around 1000 BC, Aguada Phoenix proves that early communities across Mesoamerica were building monumental ceremonial centers on a scale far larger than previously imagined. We are realizing that what we currently know of the Olmec is merely the tip of a vast submerged iceberg of human history. This brings us back to where our journey first began. For centuries, Western textbooks taught us that American history was a relatively young narrative, one that began with European exploration, wooden ships crossing the Atlantic, and colonial settlements on the eastern coast. We were led to believe that true ancient history, the history of grand engineering, complex mathematics, written language, and cosmic philosophy, was a story that belonged exclusively to the Old World. The Olmec shatter that narrow world view forever. Over 3,500 years ago, in a harsh, swampy wilderness that should have been impossible to conquer, a group of brilliant indigenous visionaries looked at the mud, the stone, and the stars and decided to build something eternal. Without iron, without wheels, and without contact with any other continent, they engineered artificial mountains, carved 10-ton faces out of volcanic basalt, invented writing and zero, mapped the universe, and sparked a cultural golden age that lasted for millennia. They were not a footnote in the margins of history. They were the true, undisputed mother culture of the Western Hemisphere. The next time you look at the towering pyramids of the Maya, the golden masks of the Aztecs, or the vibrant tapestry of modern American history, remember that it all began deep in the quiet, mist-shrouded jungles of southern Mexico, where the giant stone faces of the Olmec still stand, staring silently into eternity. guarding the true birth of a continent.